Welcome back to another soft-spoken Shakespearean sonnet analysis. I thought we'd go back to the beginning of Shakespeare's sonnet cycle, to sonnet number 3, which is one of the procreation sonnets. And by the end of today's analysis, you'll understand why they're called the procreation sonnets. These are sonnets 1 through 17, and again, they're part of that fair youth cycle of sonnets. So this is one of the sonnets to the fair youth. If you're wondering about my nails, I let my daughter choose my nail polish today. So did kind of a hack job. If you're here for like gorgeous manicures, this probably isn't the channel for you. But we're going to analyze some poems. Okay, so sonnet number 3. Again, the first time we encounter a sonnet, we're just going to read through it and try to understand as much of it as we can. This is a more difficult sonnet than the last one. So again, don't be stressed if you don't ever understand everything on a first read. We're going to get to it. Look in thy glass and tell the face thou viewest. Now is the time that face should form another, whose fresh repair, if now thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world. Unblessed mother, for where is she so fair whose uneared womb disdains the tillage of thy husbandry? Or who is he so fond will be the tomb of his self-love to stop posterity? Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. So thou through windows of thine age shall see, despite of wrinkles, this thy golden time. But if thou live, remembered not to be, die single, and thine image dies with thee. Again, before we really dive into our analysis, we're going to figure out any words that may be difficult. And in this case, some words that are familiar to us, but maybe not in the way they were used in Shakespeare's time. I have glass, which in this poem is going to mean mirror. Beguile has a couple different meanings. It can mean to charm, but in this case, it can mean to deprive someone through trickery. The next line is fair. And again, we know that, we probably know that fair is synonymous with beautiful. And I just want to mention, in Shakespeare's time, it was also literally like the more pale you were, the more beautiful you were. And that was because it was a very colorist culture. And even like if you had rosy cheeks or you had freckles, you were considered less beautiful than someone whose skin was like completely porcelain and transparent. So you'll see that word used a lot in Shakespeare, both to mean beautiful and literally paler skinned. Uneared, I had to look up. It can literally mean without an ear, but it can also mean like unplanted, as in land. And this continues onto the next line, this metaphor. That's one of my least favorite metaphors in romantic poetry, of wombs as like fertile land. Tillage, right, is like plowing, literally. And husbandry, it means like farming. But also, in this case, it's a pun, and it's like literally meaning being a husband. Here, fond is not the fond that we think of, but it means foolish, which is actually foolish and fond come from the same root. And it's an ableist root, so again, Shakespeare's going to be problematic based on modern standards. Posterity here means like your descendants, your children, your offspring. Okay, again we get the glass meaning mirror. And I think that that's it for words that we need to define before we get started with our analysis. I wanted to share with you too that this is one of the first sonnets that Shakespeare wrote. And when he started these sonnets, he was 29 years old. So yes, he's writing to a fair youth who must have been considerably younger than him, enough for Shakespeare to feel the difference in their age. But it's not like Shakespeare was like some gross, crotchety old man. Although by the standards of life at the time, he was certainly middle-aged, if not, approaching the end of his life. So you've got this 29-year-old Shakespeare writing this sonnet, and he writes 17 sonnets that are all very similar and are on this same theme that we're going to see. So what is Shakespeare saying to the youth? It's almost like all 17 of these sonnets are like rough drafts of an argument he's making to try to persuade the youth. And persuade the youth to do what, right? Let's figure that out. So look in thy glass, look in your mirror, and tell the face thou viewest, tell the face you see. Now is the time that face should form another. All right? So what's Shakespeare saying? He's saying, look at yourself in the mirror and decide, tell yourself to have a baby, right? Now is the time that face should form another. Like, it's time for you to have a baby. Why? Let's keep going. Whose fresh repair, again, he's referring to the face here. The face is the whose. Whose fresh repair, if now thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world, unbless some mother. So whose fresh repair, if now thou not renewest, he's saying, if you don't kind of make yourself young again by having a baby, so if you don't procreate, don't have a baby, thou dost beguile the world. You're depriving the world through trickery, okay? You're cheating the world out of your beautiful face. And not just the world, right? You're cheating the world and some mother who will be unblessed because you chose not to have a baby with her. For where is she so fair whose uneared womb? So where is someone so beautiful that her empty, her unplanted womb, God forbid, disdain, so looks down on, in case you don't know that word, we should have looked that up, disdains the tillage of thy husbandry. So there's this long extended metaphor of this imaginary wives' womb as a piece of fertile land that's just yearning to be plowed by Shakespeare's young man, which is like kind of super gross, but right. So basically he's saying no woman is so beautiful that she wouldn't want to make your babies. Or who is he? So now he's kind of referring to the youth in the third person. Or who is he so foolish, so fond, will be the tomb of his self-love to stop prosperity. So he's saying you're going to die. You're so selfish and foolish that you're going to die, and like your genes are going to die because you won't have kids, right? No one is so proud and foolish not to have kids. And this is weird stuff, right? By modern standards. Yes. Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee. Okay? You look like your mother's reflection, right? You look like your mother, and she looks like thee. Calls back the lovely April of her prime. So you remind her of when she was young. Remember in the last poem, we learned that April equals youth, equals the springtime of your life, right? So when your mother looks at you, she's reminded of how beautiful she used to be. Okay. So you through windows of thine age shall see, despite of wrinkles. So even when you're old and wrinkly, you'll see this thy golden time. Even when you're old and wrinkly, you'll remember your young hot self by looking at your child. Who doesn't want that? Okay. But if thou live, remembered not to be. So he's saying if you decide to not be remembered in a child, die single, and thine image dies with thee, right? So basically the poem's ending on a threat. If you don't have a kid, no one will remember your hotness, and you'll die alone. So, who wouldn't want to receive this love poem? Let's talk about it a little bit in the context of Shakespeare's society and our own society. And then we'll also do a little rhythmic analysis at the end. I'll save that for the end because that's the most fun. So I've been doing some research, and in Shakespeare's time, homosexuality was not the concept that it is today. There was sort of a feeling that anyone who was a sexual deviant, so anyone who had sex outside of marriage, period, probably had homosexual urges. Liking boys wasn't necessarily seen as much more sinful or divergent than just having sex with a woman outside of wedlock. This really intense homophobia that we have now in our culture and are starting to break away from really didn't come into being until the Victorian era, which is much later than Shakespeare's time. So again, we've got Shakespeare, age 29, writing to his young lover, maybe who's in his early 20s. So though these men could write and publish love poems to each other, right? And probably it was an open secret to all of their acquaintances that they were getting it on. They couldn't have started a life together, right? They still could not have gotten married or probably even moved in together and have that be socially acceptable. I sort of see this poem as Shakespeare shyly starting out. He's almost saying this isn't a love poem. This is an essay. This is an argument to get you to have kids so that your hotness will go on for eternity. And Shakespeare's almost protecting his ego or protecting himself from rejection by distancing his own emotions. It's not a poem about his love for the young man or how beautiful he thinks the young man is. It's about how objectively beautiful the young man is and how he's going to deprive some mother of his beauty if he doesn't have kids. He's going to cheat the whole world out of his beauty if he doesn't have kids. I think that's really interesting. And it's hey, this isn't for me. This is for everybody else, I see Shakespeare being a little defensive here about that. I think we should also just mention, it is kind of a really creepy thing to be I want you to have kids so your beauty will live on. It gives me a little bit Jacob and Bella from Twilight vibes, which, by the way, I never read the books, but I am familiar with the plot, and I think I suffered through a movie and a half of it. That's a weird thing, right? And he's so he's saying, do it for the world, do it for some mother, do it for your own good, do it for you don't die alone. But he never says, do it for me, right? I think that Shakespeare is going to come to regret these procreation poems when we see what comes later in the sonnet cycle. a few years down the road, Shakespeare is not going to be trying to convince his young man to sleep with some woman. And he might live to regret these kinds of arguments. The last thing I think we should do is a rhythmic analysis, just to tease out a little bit of extra meaning. And like I told you, Shakespeare is a master of this iambic pentameter that he writes in, and anytime he breaks it, there might be a reason. So right off the bat in this poem, he starts off breaking the iambic pentameter that we looked at last time. So the first syllable, look, is stressed and unstressed. This is a trochee, the opposite of an iamb. Then it falls back into the sing-song. Look in thy glass and tell the face thou viewest. Right? So we get the da-da, 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 da-da. And there's a little extra syllable hanging off the end here. There's a little extra unstressed syllable. Same pattern repeats on the next line. Now, first syllable is stressed. Now is the time that face should form another. Same pattern, an extra syllable at the end and a stressed full syllable. And instead of sounding like da 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 da, it sounds like da 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 da. It's starting with an imperative. It's demanding. This was the third procreation sonnet that Shakespeare wrote, and I feel like, again, he's writing all these rough drafts of this argument to his lover, trying to convince his lover, oh, you need to go get married and have kids, for the greater good. And it seems to me like he's getting frustrated by this point, by the time he's written his third sonnet. The young man is saying no over and over. Maybe the young man is like, no, it's just you I want, Willie. But Shakespeare is saying, like, look, you need to do it. He's being very imperative. He's commanding his young man. So we get a little extra unstressed syllable at the end here, and then it falls into very consistent iambic pentameter until the end. The last line, right? We get another imperative. Die single. And in this case, there's two stressed syllables in a row, which is very strong. Die single, and thine image dies with thee. Maybe you heard it when I read the poem. It kind of jumps out at you. Again, to me, it's expressing this frustration, right? Like, if you don't go and have a kid, you're gonna die alone. So is Shakespeare's feeling in this poem of desperately wanting his lover to have a child so that his beauty will live on? Do you think that that's genuine? Or do you think, as I do, that in a way it was a way to write a sonnet to his beautiful young man, praising him and expressing how beautiful he thinks his young man is without coming right out and saying, I'm so in love with you? I'm really curious to hear what you think in the comments. Was this all sort of a ploy to sort of start writing sonnets to his lover for a logical reason rather than to just sort of gush out his feelings, which would maybe be seen as like not, which is a vulnerable thing to do, right? Eventually Shakespeare gets there. He gets to the sonnets that are just gushing about how beautiful the fair youth is, but this is almost like a warm-up, saying this poem is not for me, this poem is for you, for the mother, for the world, so that your beauty can live on. It's an objective fact, I think that's really interesting, and it's one reason why this sonnet is one of my favorites of the procreation sonnets. So yeah, if you enjoyed this, as always, let me know in the comments. And I hope that you drifted off to sleep maybe hearing this. I hope the audio was a little bit better this time. I did a different setup so that hopefully you could hear the pen scratching sounds better. And I'll be back next time with another sonnet, and we can continue learning about Shakespeare's relationship with his fair